And now we're going to move on, especially in the data governance aspect. Next, please. Yeah. Okay, so before I explain in detail about what is data governance and what is data management, I want all of us to be on the same page and to realize the importance and urgency of data governance. So, what is data governance and why organizations need to govern data? Here are several points regarding as an answer for the question, and just for an additional note, these points not specifically applied for big data, but also for overall data. So the first point is to avoid inconsistent data silos in different departments and business units. So as we may know, each unit in National Statistics Office might collect their own data, and later on in this age may collect their own big data. So we need to ensure that there are no inconsistency between those data, and the data is not silo anymore. And then we need to agree on common data definitions for a shared understanding of data, because then again, each unit and other units can have like different concept of the data. So we need to find a way to find a common data definition for that. And we also need to improve data quality through efforts to identify and fix error in datasets. As has been explained by Pak Setia before, we know that in big data there are many errors, just like in traditional data, especially regarding like noises and then missing value and something like that. We need to find a way and solution to improve the data quality. And next is we need to increase analytics accuracy and give decision makers reliable information. This point is related to the one that Mbak Diar has explained, that later on we hope that big data can be used for small area estimation, which can increase analytics accuracy until the smallest level of region. And then we also need data governance to implement and enforce policies that help prevent data errors and misuse. This one is regarding, it's related to the last point, that is to help ensure compliance with data privacy laws and other regulations. So as we know, as with the emerging of big data, with the amount of data that keeps on increasing, the other issue that arises regarding data is ethical use of data. Like one of the example that also been mentioned is about data privacy. Whether or not, we can collect data freely, but maybe some for big data, but maybe some of those data contain like confidential or privacy information. So we need to manage that in order to protect the privacy of the owner of the data before we deliver the data to the consumers. Yeah, so that's some of the reasons why data governance is very important. And then moving on from after we have understand the important and hopefully we can realize the urgency of that, we're going to move on to the explanation of the basic concept of data management principle. So data governance is basically a part of data management. Data management is like the bigger part, and data governance is a part of that. So data governance principle is basically similar to data management principles. And what are those? The first one is that data is valuable. So maybe lately we have heard that data is a more valuable asset compared to oil or whatever, like we know the slogan about data is the new oil. And that's because data is a very valuable asset with unique properties. And maybe for us, for like National Statistics Office, we don't like monetize the data directly, but we also need to realize that in the future, in the long term, that data can bring a great benefit to the government in a whole. And then the next principle is that data management requirements are business requirements. So this is regarding the data-driven or needs-driven. So sometimes the both of them are needs to be combined, like to build your own data management requirements, you first need to understand what is your business and your organization's requirement. And then for that, we need to also note several points, like managing data means managing the quality of the data. So you can just like manage the data without considering the quality of the data. And then just like it has been explained before by Bu Novi, for data management to work properly, we need to ensure the appropriate use of metadata. And we also, in the specified needs phase, we also need to make a proper and like clear planning on how to manage the data also. And then finally, data management requirements must drive information technology decisions. So if you remember from the previous explanation, there are like business process layer, and then there's the data layers. From business process, business requirement, we like derive the data management requirement, and then from that we derive the information technology requirements. So from the data, then we can analyze or we can identify what kind of technology that we need in order to manage that. And then the third principle is that data management is also life cycle management. So in GSBPM and also SBFA, we have seen that the data phase is not only like a singular phase, but it consists of several phases that's like subscale from each other. And then different types of data have different life cycle characteristics. So this is talking about like, in SBFA, there are like 8 phases, starting from specify needs to evaluate. And then there are several product classes like national accounts, and then derived data, price statistic that has been explained. And some of the data may have like different life cycle from each other. For example, because national accounts is using data from other sources like census and survey, so they don't necessarily have like their own collect phase. Instead of they collect the data collection used from other survey. And then throughout this life cycle management, when we manage the data, we also need to manage the risks that associated with the data. So for example, in the collect phase, what are the risks there? Like what if there's like missing data? What if there's non-response? What if the data is unavailable? We need to take that points into consideration and try to mitigate and identify the possible solutions for that. And then the last principle is that data management depends on diverse skills. So data management is a cross-functional principle. It's not like just because maybe from the title itself, data management, it sounds like a high-level aspect kind of thing, but actually it not only requires like managerial aspect and knowledge, but it also requires technical skills. So yeah, it needs the second point, data management requires an enterprise perspective. This is because we need to understand the business requirement and that alignment with organization needs in a whole. So we need managerial aspect for that, managerial knowledge for that. But we also need to account for a range of perspectives. That is the last point. And this range of perspectives is talking about like the technical skills, like starting from the technical issue regarding the data, and then technical issue regarding the technology to manage the data. Okay, please next. Yeah. Now that we have understand the data management principle, we're going to talk more specifically about data governance. So this is like, let's call it this data governance wheel. And I take this from DAMA, Data Management Book, Data Management Body of Knowledge. I forgot to mention this before. So basically, for data governance and data management, the international best practice that's out there is Data Management Body of Knowledge, and it was published by Unistats Wiki, similar to the other best practice. And yeah, for this we refer to that mostly. You can find it in the internet. Currently, the latest version is version 2. And then now we back to talk about the data governance. This is the data governance wheel that we are going to talk about. As you can see, basically there are like 3 main components of that. That is the data governance itself, and you can see it as the outer cycle. And then the life cycle management, the triangular shape. And then the foundational activities, the one below the life cycle management. So what is each of this actually? Well, I'm going to try to explain them one by one. And just to remind you, if there's anything that you find unclear or you find confusing, you can always ask and type your question in the chat box, or we can discuss it later. Okay, so basically, we're going to talk first about the foundational activities. So foundational activities like data protection, privacy, security risks management, metadata management, and data quality management, it's an activities that span throughout the data lifecycle. So just like previously in SBFR or GSPPM, there are like data quality and metadata and data management as overarching components. This one is also an overarching activities that needs to be defined first. So yeah, identifying them will help us to enable better design decisions and make data easier to use. And if these activities are executed well, data is less expensive to maintain, and data consumers will have more confidence in it, and the opportunities for us to manage and utilize our data to its fullest can expand. So for metadata management, well, maybe I'm just going to talk about several sample of them, not all of them. For example, for metadata management, as has been explained before, with the use of metadata management, we can like ensure like that each process are conducted correctly. And so the information of the metadata information can help us like determine whether or not the process has been done correctly, and it can also like act as a documentation for the process that we have done. And then later on, if we want to conduct another activities, let's say another surveys or another big data activities, we can refer to that information, to that metadata, and we can evaluate what went great, what went wrong, what can be improved, and something like that. And by having that, our next activities, our next big data collection maybe will be better than the previous one, and in turn, this will like improve our overall data protection. Okay, so that's the importance of foundational activities. And then the life cycle management. So the life cycle management is containing a set of domains that need to be maintained throughout the life cycle phase. So for the data governance or data management, the life cycle is basically divided into three parts. That is plan and design, and then there is use and enhance, and at last there is enable and maintain. So each of the phases containing the term is like knowledge area or data domain that need to be maintained in each phase. So for example, in the plan and design, the knowledge area or the data domain is that needs to be maintained is architecture, modeling, and design. So in data governance and data management, first of all, we need to plan and design the architecture of our data. And for this one, in BPS Statistics Indonesia, maybe we have seen it in the previous explanation in our framework for big data. That's one of the example of the architecture that we have designed. And then we can move on to like breaking down that high level architecture into like a more technical modeling, because you know there's like several data modeling concepts, from like conceptual model, logical model, and then finally physical model. Yeah, and then we can design how to use that architecture and those data model. And for use and enhance, it explain how we use the architecture, the design that you have created in the previous phase, and use and enhance them to support the organization's needs. So the kind of knowledge or domain that we can use or enhance are like data science, data visualization, data monetization. Well, because this is a general framework and not only but NSO. Maybe for NSO we can like define it differently, the monetization part. And then there is like predictive analytics regarding to the data science, and then master data usage. Master data is like the reference data. It's similar to that. And then business intelligence, and finally document and content management. So yeah, after we have planned and designed our architecture, and we can, after we define the metadata management for that, we define the security risk management and data quality management, we can apply all of that to use and enhance this data domain. And finally, we can also enable and maintain another part of data domain. For example, like big data storage, data warehousing, master data management, and then data storage and operations, reference data management, and also data integration and interoperability. So this one, like the domain in enable and maintain, it's more like the more advanced part of the data domain in the use and enhance. So the use and enhance is like the basic domain that we usually use in our operational activities, and enable and maintain is more like the advanced activities like big data, something like, and data integration and interoperability, yeah, something like that. And then finally, we will talk about the outer cycle, that is the data governance, and it contains a set of required components for effective data governance. So similar to foundational activities, this one is like an overarching activities, but the difference is for foundational activities, mostly you need to define them at first, but for data governance, you can define them along with implementation of the data governance itself. So some of the components, it's like the policy. Okay, so one of the example of the policy is like data need to be related and to be linked with its metadata. That's one of the policy that's needed in order to support the use and enhance of this data domain, or the enable and maintain of this data domain. And then there's also stewardship and ownership. This is regarding like the division of roles and responsibility in data governance. So we need to know who is in charge of what, who is in charge of what. So we can ensure that each of the roles have their own set of responsibilities. And so in case something goes wrong, we can ask, and we can like, yeah, we can ask the right person in order to solve that problem. And then there's also culture change or change management. It is to ensure that throughout the implementation of this lifecycle management, in case there's like resistance to change, or in case there is need to transform a business process from like the current state into the future state, we need to ensure that all of the stakeholders and of the employees will be able to support that, and we need change management for that. And then for the strategy, it's also similar. It's basically the strategy to implement all of that. And then there's also like principle and ethics regarding how to use that data, how to manage that. And then there's also data evaluation. This one is similar to data monetization, but this one is more like the general term. So in order for us to perform well and smooth data governance, we need to ensure that the cost in collecting the data is worth it. Like we need to ensure the cost for collecting the data is equal, and yeah, equal to the benefit of the benefit that we gain from obtaining the data. And then there's also data maturity assessment and data classification. Next. Okay, so from the wheel of data management body of knowledge previously, now we are going to talk about how to design our own data governance that's suitable or appropriate according to our organization needs. So in data management body of knowledge, there is like this diagram, context diagram. This is basically a guideline to help us design our own data governance. It mainly consists of definition, goals, and then the business drivers and the technical drivers. So this one is an example of how to design a data governance. So first you need to define the goal. Why do you want to implement a data governance? Like for example, the goals is we want to enable an organization to manage data as an asset. And then we want to define with maybe you can you can download the book later to get a clearer picture of this. So basically, first we need to define our goals. And then after we define our goals, we need to define the business drivers that we need and the technical drivers that we need in order to realize and achieve those goals. So to help our organizations to manage the data as an asset, we need several inputs. You can define inputs as something that you need as basic information. That will help you to plan out the next activities. So for this example, the inputs is, if you want to create your own data governance, the inputs that you need are business strategies and goals, and then IT strategies and goals, and then data management and data strategies, organizational policies and standard, and also business culture assessment, data maturity assessment, IT practices, and regulatory requirements. So mostly for this case, mostly these inputs came in the form of document or legal product, something like that for regulatory. And basically we need them in order to understand what is the important or the main needs of our organizations. Our goals is we want our organization to manage data as an asset. But before we can achieve that goals, we need to first realize what is our organization's needs and why it needs to manage the data as an asset. Then we can use that inputs to define that. And then after we gather the information that we required from the inputs document, we can plan the activities that we need to do. For example, the first activity in designing a data governance is define data governance for the organizations, including develop data governance strategy, perform readiness assessment, and then perform discovery and business alignment, and finally develop organizational touch points. And then after we define the data governance for the organizations, we can define the data governance strategy. We can define which framework we want to adopt, which one we want to use, and how we're going to modify that to suit our needs. And basically that's the main point of the second activities. But in details, you can see there are the first point is define and data governance operating framework, develop goals, principles, and policies, and underwrite data management projects, engage in change and issue management, as we have talked about before, and finally assess regulatory compliance requirement. And then after you define the data governance and data governance strategy, you can finally implement that data governance that you have designed. This is the points that you can do when implementing data governance. And then finally, you can embed data governance. So embed data governance is basically maybe in the future, in the long term, you can turn this data governance into some legal products, regulatory requirement to be used for other aspects. And then after we have gathered the inputs, we've done the required activities, we can finally, produce deliverables. And our deliverables can be data governance strategy and data strategy, and some of that. You can read it. And that's the business drivers that we need to design a data governance. Now moving on to the technical drivers. For inputs, so technical drivers is basically something that help you to find the business drivers, to support the business drivers. For the example, for the inputs, this document, we can obtain those documents from the suppliers. The suppliers can be business executive, because usually they know the vision of the organizations, they know the high level needs of the organization, or maybe the data stewards or data owners, subject matter expert, and some other roles that's there. And then during performing the activities, we need to include several participants, for example, steering committee, chief information officer, and then chief data officer or chief data steward, executive data stewards, and so on. it depends on your organizations. You can modify that. And then finally, the deliverables, we need to ensure that our deliverables can answer and basically answer the needs for the consumers. And the consumers for data governance product is data governance bodies, project managers, compliance team, and so on. So the product of this activity is data governance, and those data governance finally can be used as a guideline for other teams or other project manager officer when they conduct their own activity regarding data collections. I'm sorry, I need to revise myself. Supplier, participants, and consumer is still part of business drivers. And then the technical drivers, like the technical parts, this one is the technical part that we need to support those. For the example, is like for tools to implement the activities, we can use like workflow tools or document management tools. And then we can also use like a website or something in order to help us to find the necessary information or to put the necessary deliverable for it to be accessible. And then we can also use some metrics. This one is useful to ensure that our deliverable is compliant to regulatory and internal data policies. So for example, our deliverable is data governance. We need metrics, and the metric usually consists of questions like, is data governance in alignment with organization needs? Is data governance able to help the organizations find a solution for its challenges, something like that? We need to answer these metrics to ensure the deliverables that we produce is in a high quality. Yeah, so basically that's like the overall explanation of this part. And then the next slide, please. Yeah, so after we talk about the international best practice of data governance, we talk about how to design our own data governance from the guideline that has been provided. I'm going to share a bit about data governance in PPS, but just for you to know, we're also still learning to improving that. So this is not a final document. This is like a living document that will be continuously improved and maintained. So in last year, in 2020, we have designed a data governance draft for our data management, and we designed that based on our organization needs and our IT strategy and goals. And later on, hopefully, if it has been reviewed by several stakeholders, if we have deemed it's qualified enough, then maybe we can formalize it into a legal product. And basically, our data governance book, let's call it book, consists of three main parts. That's development phase, operational phase, and maintenance phase. This is similar to the life cycle before, like plan and design, use and enhance, and then finally enable and maintain. So in development phase, we're going to list out activities that we need to perform in order to like develop data management or maybe a data management system. And then in the operational phase, we list the activities that we need in order to ensure that the operational activities of the organizations can run smoothly. And then for maintenance phase, we're talking about how to maintain what we have developed and what we have performed in our daily operational. We need to maintain that in order for it to be sustainable. And then for each of those parts, there are several main components. That's activities that I have explained. And then there is also standard, policies, procedures, role as responsibilities, or we usually call it like RACI metrics. I will talk about it later. And finally, the quality metrics that I have briefly mentioned earlier. And next. Okay, so this is like a more detailed explanation, a more detailed example of that in order to help us gain a better understanding of this. So for the example, one of the activity during like development phase is data migration, right? So when we first develop our data management system, we need to move our existing data that is in different repositories and whatsoever, we need to migrate it into our single source repository. And then for that, we need data migration activity. And the related policies for data migration activities is, for example, data source policy and data acquisition policy. So the activities will explain like how the data migration process should be done, and then the policies list out the point that we need to follow when we conduct this activity. Like for example, a data source policy might consist of a point that say a data source that can be migrated to single source of repository is blah 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 blah, like something like that. And then data acquisition policy might have a point like the data acquisition method that can be used is like machine to machine, ETL, or something like that. It's the example of policy. And then for standards, the related standards, maybe we can have like data ingestion standards and data source standard. So for data source standard, maybe one of the point is like the data source that's used for migration needs to meet these following criteria. And maybe this criteria can be like it is accessible, it contains data that's like still in a timely manner and not out of date, something like that. And for data ingestion standard, this can contain several points like the format of the data that can be used for data ingestion or data migration, and data type, something like that. Like usually the standard is more like technical. Sometimes it is a set of criteria that needs to be met. And then for procedures, this is basically like the step-by-step or a more detailed step in order to conduct that activities. And then this picture is an example of a set of activities that we have. If you can see it, there is the point A is for development, point B is for operational, and C is for maintenance. And then for each of that, we have standards and policies, and we ensure that each of them are linked and related like this. And next. And this is about the procedures. This is the example of procedures. So you list like the more detailed activity. And then for each of that, you need to define who is responsible and who is in charge, which role will be performing for that. You define that basically for procedures. And then for roles and responsibility, this is similar to the procedures, but this is more like you need to know, like for example, for this one, chief data officer. Chief data officer is also taking part in data ingestion, but his contribution, he's not the one in charge. So basically, RICHI matrix stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So chief data officer also takes part in data ingestion, but he's not the one responsible. He's not the one in charge. He's not the one doing the ETL or machine-to-machine acquisition, but he is his role is only to be the one that's going to be informed. So if a data ingestion activity is to be performed, we need to inform the chief data officer. And then, for example, like, so who is the one that's going to be in charge? In this matrix, we can briefly see that the ones that's responsible is data integration specialist. So he or she is the one that's going to do all the ETL and technical stuff. And for that, he needs to ensure to consult with data steward team and then inform the chief data officer and data management executive. Like that's one of the example of roles and responsibilities or matrix RICHI. And lastly, I'm sorry, this one is like a typo. This one below roles and responsibilities, it's supposed to be like matrix quality. So yeah, this is the example of the matrix quality that I have talked about before. So you define the indicator, and then you can assess your own activities, whether or not the activities that you've done has met those indicator. And then we can also like define a threshold, like for example, whether or not the data that's migrated has been migrated successfully, completely, accurately, something like that. And maybe you can like range it in the scale from 1 to 10, and the threshold is 7. So if it passed 7, then it's considered success, something like that. That's the use of quality metrics, basically to ensure that the activities you've done is done correctly according to the standards and procedures. Okay, well, I think that's all for data governance and data management.